it's now time for our panel discussion. So I'll be opening up the floor here to all of our panelists and taking a moment to ask questions that have come in this morning. So if we can bring everybody back up on screen. Looks good. Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. I am going to be turning to the Slido, first of all, to give folks who've been asking questions an opportunity to check in with our participants. And one of the top voted questions that we have today is from Peter Czaplinski from the province, and it's directed to Doug. And I think we'll take this time to try to focus on questions that are directly identified to each of our speakers, just to give each of you a moment to comment. And actually, before I do that, we've had a few speakers this morning. We've had a variety of topics. So I'd just like to pause and for any of the invited panelists, if you have any comments that you'd like to add to your talk, you're welcome to provide that to us now. And if not, I'll move to questions. So just give you a moment if there's anything you'd like to add to your conversation this morning. Perfect. Okay, we'll take that. So as I said, one of the more popular questions we have on Slido is directed to Doug from Peter, and I'll just paraphrase. And Doug, in your talk, you identified that your work takes a watershed perspective, and Peter's identified there are physical processes around hill slopes and valley bottoms, riparian areas, and stream channels, and those are all important. And I'm wondering if you can speak to whether or not your program addresses these components in your research.
Yeah, and so right now, the watershed approach that we're describing, I guess, refers more to the spatial distribution throughout the larger basin of the North Thompson. In terms of understanding those processes within individual streams or watersheds at that scale, which I think Peter is talking about, right now we don't tackle any of that. And part of that is because of the intensity of monitoring and the challenges to do that. And so that's remains a challenge. And I think for a lot of the work we do, we're trying to build a foundation. And I would argue we're kind of early in time for our program in the watershed. And so those are things that could be built out as we move forward with the program.
Great. Thank you very much, Doug.
Okay. Sorry, I was just going to say, I'll take the next question. I guess it's probably going to be lobbed over to you, Mike, from Daphne. And I guess just from her experiences, she's been in the mushy middle, it sounds like. So looking for some advice on how to perhaps avoid that with some critical points.
That's this Mike, I guess. Yeah, I suppose it's a question of thinking about your resources and the effort and maybe some analyses, being realistic about what you're sampling and how variable it is and what you can achieve from it. And I don't think there's a shortcut to that, except to maybe you've got enough information right now to kind of get an idea of the variability you're trying to get a handle on, and use that to plan going forward. But it's particularly with salmon, sampling fish is extremely challenging. And so, as I mentioned, with these functional monitoring variables, it's a question of, as in others, using indicators and being satisfied that if your indicators are showing promise or improvement, that that's sufficient level. That is a sufficient level of monitoring to be satisfied with your project's performance. For example, nailing down the salmon piece is often pretty difficult.
Dale, can I just ask a follow-up to that?
Yeah, you bet.
And Mike, I'll direct this to you, but after you've commented, I'll invite any of the other panelists to just pursue this further. So just on that, one of the things that maybe I took from your talk this morning was that the idea of avoiding that mushy middle might not be so much in the domain of smaller localized entities that might be doing restoration projects on a proposal by proposal basis type of thing, but it might be more for them to be participants in something that's more systematic, that would be led by more of a coordinated exercise, maybe by DFO or some combination of entities. Would that be a fair takeaway of that point, because I'm looking at this going, yeah, mushy middle, it makes sense, but as PSF, we're funding 40, 50, 60 small restoration projects every year. We're interested in knowing are the things that we're supporting groups to do making a difference, but I'm not sure it's within the parameters of any smaller group to take that idea on their own, but maybe more for them to be participants in something that would be working more systematically towards that. So I'll put that out as a comment for you to respond to.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And it might be a situation where, and again, this is to the question of what the information is for and who's going to use it. For example, if you do some fish sampling and show that there's some fish present, that might be sufficient for the people that you are reporting out to, or the community, or to let them know, the people that did the work, that there's some feedback in terms of response. But it's not, the information that you might collect is insufficient probably to put into a meta-analysis of fish studies, because the sampling just isn't enough. So it's really important to think about who wants the information, or where would you like it to go. But in terms of this idea of sort of a more rigorous scientific evaluation of projects by amassing results, the meta-analyses that we've talked about, it may be a question of dialing back the metrics to those metrics that are easily repeatable, that different projects can collect and they can be amassed. So, there's different purposes for the data being collected, and that's part of the thinking that has to go on in terms of how you want, what kind of monitoring you want to do.
So I'll maybe see if the other panelists want to comment on that further. Mike Pearson, I saw you were giving us a wave there. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the mushy middle is a very important concept. And it's also important to understand that the mushy middle is different between different indicators. And this was, has been alluded to, but not maybe said explicitly. So while fish are going to be very difficult to and have a large mushy middle, basically. So you have to do a lot of sampling in order to, over a long period of time, to be able to detect change, because they are highly variable. There's other things that are much less variable, like the riparian, where the mushy middle is a lot smaller, right? In that because the variability is less. The trees are there or they're not. They're not hard to catch. They're not hiding. And thinking about which variables you choose to focus on, and you can perhaps treat them in different ways. In that, for fish, maybe sampling just for presence absence, as Mike just said. Maybe for some of the other ones in water temperature and riparian zones, you could aim for something a little more robust.
No, that makes sense. Thanks for that. Karen, I was going to just see if this follows through from Mike Bradford and Mike Pearson's comments to what you were talking about from DFO efforts from a science perspective to provide some guidance for national standardization. Is that a fair takeaway from your talk in terms of that is potentially a connection? Is DFO science is looking at that? What would be some national standardization that would then help individual entities do their part to not just be doing kind of mushy middle type monitoring?
Yeah, it is. It's definitely something that is being considered. I think it also goes back to Doug's talk a little bit about what you're able to do extensively versus intensively. And it really is those metrics more on the left side that would go into what's now actually called conformance monitoring as opposed to compliance monitoring, Mike. They've changed it on us, whereas compliance has to do with have you met the law of the act, where conformance is it built as the as-built design, and is it functioning as intended? And so the idea that you could, as Mike P said, get farther away from the mushy middle a lot more quickly for those metrics on the left. And so that would be more the scale of our tier 1 monitoring. that would go across projects. And a lot of what you do in terms of if you get into the effectiveness monitoring, that's when you would have to invest the adequate funds to stay away from that mushy middle for more of the fish metrics. In some cases, presence, absence, or even an observational mention that fish are there could be adequate for fish. And, we would say, don't bother spending your money on really monitoring fish beyond presence, absence in a lot of cases. So yeah, it's definitely something that's going to be looked at. It depends on the objective of your project. It depends on the uncertainty of your results. If you're doing something that's more better understood and more well known, then you can stay more on the left. If you're in an area that is highly uncertain in terms of the effectiveness of what you're doing, plus the risk is higher in terms of understanding its success and or the implications of its failure, you might go a little bit more to the right in terms of those more intensive metrics that are in the effectiveness monitoring category.
Oh, that's great. I don't want to kind of monopolize the panel on this one thread. So, Chrissy, maybe I'll turn it back to you to go over to our next question.
Great. Thanks very much, Jason. The next question that we have up here on Slido, we've been fairly well circling around this. It's not directed to anyone in particular, so we'll go into it and we'll see what we can do. So there's a question here about balancing the one-size-fits-all approach and how that might overlook unique features of local activities. And so the question is, how might we both achieve standardization and also remain relevant for each local project? I might, just to get us started, throw over to Karen, but I think there might be some thoughts on this around the panel.
Yeah, I touched on this at the end of my talk, I guess, to a degree, that regional differences are important. But I think the closer you are, again, to the left side of Doug's diagram in terms of those levels of metrics for things, what did you call it? You got the environmental variables and the physical habitat variables. You would be able to, how you measure temperature is not rocket science, and that doesn't really change no matter where you are. You throw in some loggers, and I guess in streams versus lakes, it could be different, but whether it's accompanied by a level logger or oxygen. Anyway, how you collect these things in a lot of cases is not that variable. And where it really does get a lot more variable is in the ecotype. But again, how to measure streams characteristics is a fairly standard procedure. And I think you get more into the differences when you get up into the fish monitoring. And that's when you get more into the effectiveness monitoring, or certainly something like a whole lake construction. You're into effectiveness monitoring for that scale of offset. It's quite large. The results are uncertain. They're highly variable, and they're going to be monitoring at all kinds of levels and staying away from the mushy middle because they have the money and the resources and the time to put into monitoring these properly. So I think basically if somebody else has something to add.
Yeah, I'll just give the other panelists a moment if there's anything else. No.
I'm thinking that for one way to approach it would be to have some fairly standardized indicators that would be applicable across, maybe not the country, but perhaps a region. And then but leaving space or opportunity for specific indicators that would address target species or particular habitat types. But so the idea being that you can allow for that customization, but still maintain this base of indicators that can be used for larger meta-analysis.
Right.
What's going on.
Yeah, so and it seems like there's been kind of a consistent thread through a few of the talks. There's a subset of these core indicators which are really relevant and understood and can be applied in systematic ways across places. And there might be a list of other indicators or other metrics or other sampling protocols that people can choose from given their local context. And I think that's a good take home, and having some guidance on that seems really relevant to our restoration practitioners. I'll pass it on perhaps to Dale if you'd like to ask the next question.
Great. The next question from Herb Tepper, a respected biologist in the interior. I guess it's really getting around frequency of monitoring and how we should be undertaking that. It's probably something that you all have some thoughts around. Maybe I'll just jump to Doug to start it off with, and Doug, maybe you can give your perspective on frequency monitoring, when and we should be doing this, or is it a variable based on what you're trying to actually achieve in the monitoring?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Dale. So, frequency is difficult because you could just monitor all the time, and that would be nice, but it's not going to necessarily. You're going to get diminishing returns on the frequency in which I think what maybe the person asking the question is referring to is the frequency with which you'd return back to a project to measure effectiveness. And so I'm going to assume that's the question, and I can be corrected if I'm wrong. But I think, initially after a project, a restoration project is completed, I think you want, more frequent visits to understand whether or not it actually took hold and things are working. And then from then on, I think, the frequency you can have larger intervals between return visits. But I do think there's a challenge that we're faced with in that we probably walk away from a lot of projects and don't monitor them past 5 years, I would assume. And someone might have more experience on that than me. But I think that's where one of the big gaps in our knowledge is how do these projects persist through time? And thinking about, other watershed processes, how do they potentially compromise these projects? And so imagine big flood events that we've seen over recent years. How do those then affect those restoration projects that may have been intact for the past 10 or 20 years? So I think that's a challenging question when you get further out in terms of understanding the frequency. But immediately after, I would assume that it would be the first few years would be monitored. Maybe someone else has some further insights into that.
Go ahead, Karen.
This was touched on in the last CSAS, so the discussions around it are certainly not settled. They're going to be settled more in the future CSASs. So I guess I'll just also put a plug out if anybody is really interested in being part of any of the future steps. You can fire me an email, and of course, participation is limited, but we will be looking for people, especially to form those expert working groups for the detailed protocols. But anyway, I digress. The definite thought is that initially monitoring would be more frequent, at least annual, even seasonal, but it also depended on the metric that you're looking at. If you didn't expect a response immediately, then you might not actually start that intensive monitoring immediately. Anyway, you might wait a little bit. It depends on the metric. That after you have some establishment of function, that you could probably dial back the frequency for which you return, and you go to some periodic period, depending on the metric again, as to how often you go back. And then if you ever really could declare it done, there was talk that that's not necessarily even the case, that if there was a catastrophic event, a flood or something that warranted a revisit to see how it went, that we would have some mechanism in place to trigger a revisit, even if officially you're sort of more in a surveillance monitoring type of long-term effort.
Yeah, your last point really touches on what Doug was talking about, the need for any type of monitoring to be adaptable and responsive to the changing conditions that we find ourselves in. I'll pass it over to you now, Jason.
All right. There's another one that's in our Slido here. It doesn't say it's anonymous, but we have not heard much about adaptive management throughout the presentations. So for Karen, Doug, or Mike, I'm not sure which Mike was meant. I guess it's Mike Pearson, who's done a lot of sampling and monitoring. How much does adaptive management come into play throughout your project's post-restoration project and monitoring programs?
Adaptive management has a couple of definitions. The more original nor strict one was that is an experimental design, really, where you use different treatments on different projects and then monitor them all and use that to learn. It's more commonly used on individual projects as a kind of a feedback loop where you're using your results to inform interventions or corrective measures later on in the project. And in the latter case, my oldest project, restoration project, was started in 2001, and we are still monitoring it and still going back and making changes because it's in a very modified habitat in the Lower Fraser Valley in a regional park. There's been issues with beavers diverting water out of the project completely. They dug a channel connecting it to a road, a neighboring roadside ditch. This channel was 200 meters long, was not on my radar at all as to that was a possibility. We've had increasing over time nutrient loading and increasing problems with hypoxia, like low oxygen. And so, it was, as Karen alluded to, you're never really done with these projects because the landscape continues to evolve and affect them for good or for bad. And that's partly natural processes, partly anthropogenic. But that sort of feedback loop idea of adaptive management, I think it needs to be part of all projects. I don't know how you manage that on a landscape scale when you're talking about hundreds of projects, but the fact is that particularly in human modified landscapes, you're never out of the game.
Well, that makes sense, Mike. I think that's a thoughtful response. Would any of the other panelists like to comment on that question? Doug, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think based on what Mike Pearson's experience and then looking at Mike Bradford's project on the Bridge River, these are some long-term projects that have been monitored through over long periods of time. And I think those types of projects are definitely diminishing. And so at least with DFO, my career is just beginning. And, the idea is that you have the ability to, think and learn from these projects over a longer time period and adjust your learning, I guess, and thinking around how these systems work. I think a good example of that is Carnation Creek. So it's 40 years later, and I think the group that researches that watershed is still learning really important lessons from that project. But that requires that kind of long-term perspective that I think is potentially diminishing in terms of how we conduct research and monitoring these days.
Well, I would take from those responses that there's adaptive management in terms of your project and adapting it to things that are changing within its context. But it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, any of the panelists, but maybe the message with respect to the monitoring is more have a plan and be prepared to kind of stay the course for the long term. And I'm not saying any of you said don't adapt, but it's not about chasing something that might be changing or varying over time, but it's more, thinking back to pretty much all of your talks. What are you trying to assess? What's your plan to assess it? And what are you going to do with the outputs of that? So it's about having a plan and kind of sticking to it and following it through. Would that be a fair summary of that? Or if you object to that, put up your hand and you can tell everybody that I'm wrong. Yeah, I'm going to cut that off before you call me wrong in public. And Chrissy, maybe I'll turn to you to go to our next question.
Thanks, Jason. So our next question is from Joel Harding. This one, I believe, is directed to Mike Bradford, given the terminology. And Joel's wondering if you can offer perspective on how we might prioritize functional versus effectiveness monitoring across many projects in space and time. So either focusing on a few intensively monitored projects, looking at a representative sample of work objectives throughout the region as an alternative.
You're wrong, Jason.
well played.
You can come back to that if you want, Mike.
Yeah, I know. Just want to get that in there. So this is a great question. Really, I think in the 2012 exercise that I alluded to, one of the discussions was whether effectiveness monitoring was really going to be restricted to research organizations or those with the capacity to operate under the kind of framework of a research study. So that naturally restricts, any organization has only a finite amount of capacity to embark on such. The department here in the Pacific regions probably only had one at any one point in time, whether it's Carnation Creek or some of the other long-term monitoring programs. So it is pretty tough. I would say that it would be probably, if you go back to the context of how big is the uncertainty and what are the consequences of that uncertainty, and I think that's where you'd probably want to focus the effectiveness monitoring first. So if you have restoration activities or project types for which you really don't know very much at all, that's kind of where the effectiveness monitoring should really dig in. And you're going to be down to just a handful of sites to kind of make a contribution to what is probably a larger literature worldwide. And then, those functional monitoring will be spread thinner and wider. Perhaps the uncertainty and risk isn't as great for projects that would fit into that category. So I think that'd be one axis to think about is how big is the uncertainty and what are the consequences of that uncertainty? And that might be a way of orienting your efforts.
Okay, that's a great comment. And I guess as a follow-up, I have a question. So I'm curious, do you think we're at a state of knowledge about salmon habitat and the things that are affecting salmon habitat that we have enough relevant indicators to do kind of broad functional monitoring? Are we still at a place where we really need to focus quite a bit on effectiveness monitoring? What's your sense on the state of uncertainty? Can we build a good sampling program with good indicators at this point?
I think so. There's fine details, obviously. I think so. In those US, I pointed out that they classed the restoration activities, and for something like riparian, there's quite a bit known, and so I think the capacity is there in our ecosystems to develop a suitable suite of indicators. I think the challenge we've had, through the wild salmon policy and whatnot, is that the task of going out and hitting the ground with field staff to collect measurements is just enormous, given the size of the Pacific region and the diversity in terms of habitat types. So it's more about that implementation. And so we've kind of drawn back to remote sensing kind of variables, but it would be great if we actually put some boots on the ground, at least maybe in certain areas, and started to do this work. There, as you probably know, there are models in the U.S., particularly in Oregon coastal area, where habitat monitoring has been going on for decades, and they've developed protocols and this sort of thing. And so there's lots to go on to get something going.
Great. Thanks very much for that commentary. And that's likely great news for some of our local restoration practitioners that there's a suite of these functional monitoring programs that they can implement that would be really informative for the restoration projects they're doing without necessarily needing to go to the full extent of effectiveness monitoring if they don't have the capacity to do that. So that's a really great take-home message, I think. I'll wrap up my question there, and maybe I'll move on to Dale.
Sure. Next question's from Mr. Bailey, which I'm sure most of you know, Richard. And it's really around, I guess, putting into perspective the importance of ephemeral habitats, and it's directed to initially you, Doug, and Mike Pearson. So when you're looking at prioritizing restoration opportunities, how important is it to really step back and consider these ephemeral habitats in the watersheds that they may play an important role?
You on first, Mike?
Go ahead. Okay.
Thanks.
Sure. The thing that comes to my mind right away is main stem Fraser and the freshet habitats in there. Like we've been sampling the last couple of years with Pacific Salmon Foundation support, juvenile salmonid use during freshet, and in some of these areas that are dry 11 months a year, they are the most important juvenile rearing habitat during that 1 month when they're inundated. And that is when, a lot of the sockeye are moving down, a lot of Harris and Chinook are in the river. There's, so they are, and it's not just the main stem Fraser. This also holds true for winter habitats in small streams that are flooded in along the coast and are used by coho and cutthroat. So they're not used all the time. They may not look like much when they're not wetted, but when they are used, they are the most critical habitat in the system. Often.
Yeah, and I think in the systems that I'm familiar with, it's uncertain as to how valuable these habitats are at this point. They're occupied for sure, but in some cases, they could be ecological traps. In other cases, they seem to be productive and well-used habitats. And so I think there's still a little bit, at least in the North Thompson for the sites that I've worked in, uncertainty around, how valuable the habitats are and what kind of services they provide the fish that use them. But that said, I think Richard's question kind of highlights, there are these different types of habitats that are used by fish that we tend to have much less information on. And so for coho, for example, we're thinking primarily, rearing in small tributaries. And so I think it really focuses the point that there are other habitats and those need to be considered in parallel with the kind of the main rearing systems that we think about. And I think this is where a broader perspective and watershed planning kind of comes in. So we think about how these different habitats are connected throughout the life history of the fish. And so I think that's a really important piece. So whether they, and whether or not they turn out to be the most productive or the least productive habitats, I think understanding the landscape in terms of habitat productivity is really important.
Yeah, I really pick up on that last point, Doug, and just making sure when we are contemplating restoration and prioritizing restoration to understand the processes that we're actually trying to consider to repair in our actions. So thanks for that. Over to you, Jason.
All right, next one is from Brenly. It's directed to you, Karen, but Dale, I might even invite you to think about this in terms of some commentary from the Restoration Center of Expertise, if you have any. So Karen, with respect to the science program components that you were speaking about in your talk, how can different groups, either within or outside of DFO, be kept informed about that program development and ultimately when it's going to roll out and then how we can access and activate and engage in that?
Well, officially that would be via the CSAS website. So right now, though, all that's posted is the terms of reference from the last process, and those objectives were rather lofty when we wrote those, and so they weren't fully achieved at our November CSAS. So if you go to CSAS and you search the schedule, you can just, if you type standardized monitoring, it should come up, and you can at least see those. And as things are published, they will be tied to that process on the CSAS website. The trouble is, I know that means it's not really timely, and what's published isn't actually going to be tracking, how far along we are on developing the various steps of our roadmap and achieving those. So I'm not sure the best way, because CSAS does like to keep things under wraps until it's formal and official advice. So what I presented to you today is really the content of the science response report that should be published in a couple of months. And technically, I probably, they don't want the science advice released before it's actually officially approved and published. But I know, none of what I presented was controversial or going to, be disagreed on by the participants. So I'm not too concerned about that. I guess if you really want an update, and you can't find it anywhere, I suppose you could ask me, how are the different processes going? Like I said, we're planning to hopefully have a CSAS process on the framework document. So the next step this spring, hopefully before field season starts, because that document is pretty well drafted. And then we also, we'll be working on the next ones over the coming year or two. I think the longest one's going to be developing those detailed protocols. But Mike P, I'm probably going to be coming to you, because I think that table format and what you achieved with your Excel spreadsheet and the automatic calculators looks really good. So anyway.
Well, thanks for that, Karen. And I'll sort of invoke some of my past history when I worked with DFO, working with you, Mike Bradford, others on CSAS. I think it can be a useful, credible, effective process. But even having been involved in it, I would comment that in my observation, it's obscure. Like, I've had trouble finding CSAS results from things I've been involved with. And so I say this, I realize I'm probably making a point to people that invoke this point on their own accord anyway. But if you're speaking to within your organization to DFO, I think the audience we have today, like, we've had over 450 people signed up for the session. We've had upwards of 250 present at any one time. There is an appetite for the applied community doing restoration, at least in this region, to access, understand, and be able to invoke that kind of science advice and information into the work that's occurring here. So, Dale, I don't know if this might be the bridge to you commenting on this from the Restoration Center of Expertise, but it's more, I feel like I might be channeling what a lot of people are thinking, that we intersect with from the PSF side, that say, this is great, but we need to pull it out from behind the curtains of science and get it into the hands of people that can apply it.
Yeah, maybe quickly to respond and not take too much time on this, but really, it is a challenge, right? Managing the information and trying to pull it together in an effective format. But it is also an opportunity, an exciting opportunity, and we have in front of us now. This is a great example of where we are here today. We're here to talk about information that's relevant around restoration and a variety of topics. This one's around restoration. We have a team of folks under Joel Harding, who is leading what's called our assessment or science assessment and reporting group, where we're trying to pull together the meaningful elements around restoration. What is the standardized templates, that metrics that we need to ensure, working with Chrissy in science to ensure that we're having uniformity, as well as engaging the experts. Having a vehicle and an information platform that practitioners like yourselves that are on this webinar can utilize, can go to. It's standardized, it's repeatable. We can take that information, we can be able to use it and make something out of it. Is it going to be, there's going to be a need to have some diversity in terms of when we're applying effectiveness monitoring and a broader scope, and where we're doing that in a watershed context. But at least stepping back and having government take lead with its provincial, Indigenous and external partners like PSF, for example, will have a stronger ability to take this in a place that is going to be more applicable for people, and actually be able to answer the question that always people have is, I collect this information, it goes into the box, and we never hear back of what it means. And we hopefully will have an ability to provide that back to people that are doing the work and say, here's how your work is informing how restoration is improving salmon habitat.
I appreciate that. Karen, go ahead if you want to.
I just wanted to say briefly that I do believe that the FFHPP is planning to, really take the CSAS advice and turn it into something that is more accessible on the website and is actually given to proponents and their consultants in order to use those. And so the intent is to make it more widespread and public eventually. I'm just not sure how fast that's going to happen.
Right. Well, thanks for that, Karen. And for people watching who might not get the acronym, that's DFO's Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program. We're at 12 o'clock. Chrissy, I'll maybe see, do you want to squeeze in one more question before we break for lunch, or do you want to call it now? I'll leave that in your hands.
I think the next, I think we'll see if we can circle back to that one. It's we're just going to go over time here, so we might let people have their lunch break, and and we'll have time at the end for some additional questions. This one that we have queued up seems like a fairly interesting one, but it seems like a longer conversation. So.
Okay, then with that, I think we'll call our lunch break now. I'd like to thank our panelists for spending the morning with us.